Hi, I'm Ken Fader, your friendly neighborhood archaeologist, here with another lecture in the series on pseudo-archaeology or fake archaeology or fantastic archaeology or alternative archaeology or whatever you want to call it. Today I'm going to be focusing on archaeological frauds and fakes. Now I'll be covering those other frauds throughout the series, but today I'm really going to focus on what makes an archaeological fraud. And I'm going to give you an example of a fraud that's not the most important in archaeology, not the most significant, not the most long-lived, but by far the most hilarious. More about that later. Thinking about today's lecture, I was wondering, how should I introduce archaeological frauds? How should I introduce you, my audience, to what constitutes an archaeological fraud, how they're successful? And I thought, well, I could do that, but even better, it would be for me to provide to you a primer. That is a lesson book on how you, yes, you, can pull off a successful archaeological hoax. Now, insert sarcasm emoji here, hashtag parody. A lot of archaeological fraudsters make a fundamental error. They don't produce any marketing research. What do people want to know? What do people want to hear about the human past? For example, supposing I wanted to pull off a hoax. Now, I've done archaeology here in southern New England for 40 years, and I know, and my colleagues all know, the oldest pottery, the oldest ceramic artifacts go back about 3,000 years. But I'll tell you something, in my lab, I have ceramics and I have charcoal that we can do radiocarbon date on that could completely flip that. I could take some of that pottery, I could take some of that 3,500-year-old charcoal, I could put it in the ground, pretend to excavate it, and announce it to all my colleagues. I have the oldest pottery in Connecticut, 500 years older than any of the pottery ever found before. But realistically, how many people are going to get excited by that? I know a couple of dozen professional archaeologists and maybe avocational archaeologists, maybe 50. Well, that's not a big enough audience for an archaeological hoax. Trust me, if I were to hold a press conference to announce this great discovery, unless I offered food, nobody's going to show up. Because really, who cares? National Geographic will not beat a path to my door with millions of dollars in research funding so that I can find more pottery that's 500 years older than the oldest pottery in Connecticut. That would be a foolish archaeological hoax. If you want to do a successful hoax, find out what people want to believe, give them what they want, and exploit their desire to believe. So people want to believe things about the ancient past. I'm going to talk about that specifically, things that they want to embrace. This is the way they wish things were in the past. Well, give it to them. Do the marketing research and give it to them. Now, what do people want to know about the human past? I usually break it down into three categories. So we have confirmation of religious beliefs, confirmation of scientific preconceptions, and confirmation of national, ethnic, or racial superiority. These are things that have been very successful in convincing people to embrace an archaeological hoax that if they were a little more rational, they might question. All right? Religious beliefs are a real easy thing to do for archaeological hoaxing. You're going to have a huge audience. If you can tell people, hey, I'm an archaeologist, I found a piece of the true cross. I found evidence of Noah's flood, especially if you can say, hey, I've got a piece of Noah's Ark. I dug it up. This proves the biblical story of the flood. A few years ago, there's also a message here. Your hoaxes don't have to be really good. They don't have to be very professional if people want to believe them strongly enough. A few years ago, dude announced to the world that he had climbed to the top of Mount Ararat in Turkey. He had found the remains of Noah's Ark. He had taken a chunk out of it and brought it back to America, and he presented it to a religious organization. They looked at it. They said, yeah, this is legit. This is a piece of the Ark. It's old. He said he got it in Mount Ararat. Why would he lie to us? And they embraced it as a real archaeological artifact reflecting the reality, the legitimacy, the historical accuracy of the Noah story. Turns out this guy was an atheist, and he wanted to make fun of people who believed in Noah's Ark. He announced then he had never been to Turkey. He had never climbed Mount Ararat. He had never found the true Ark. And in fact, the piece of wood that he had given to these folks was from his backyard in California. Now the wood in this piece of wood from the Ark had been aged. It looked old and it looked very stained. Well, he announced to the world how he had accomplished that. He had taken fresh wood from his backyard in California and he had marinated it in, are you ready? Teriyaki sauce. Yes, teriyaki sauce. And so now you have to ask questions about the legitimacy of this hoax. I mean, my God, nobody ever asked, why does this smell like a Chinese restaurant? That's weird for the Ark, isn't it? But they never asked. They never asked for a radiocarbon date. They never asked for an analysis of what the species of the tree was. They never asked for his passport showing that he actually had been to Turkey. None of that was asked. Why? Because people embraced the idea that here was a true piece of Noah's Ark proving a Bible story. Now, the same is true for scientists. Scientists are not immune to wanting to have the past cast in a particular way. Now, another one of these lectures on Piltdown, which is a far more significant archaeological hoax than the Cardiff Giant, that I'm going to talk about today, that a lot of scientists sort of stepped away from their usual skeptical approach and they embraced the reality of the Piltdown fossil because it reflected the way in which they thought human evolution had proceeded, with the brain expanding first. More about that in the lecture on Piltdown. That's a really exciting story too. So scientists are not immune to this. And by the way, a lot of the Piltdown fossil, in retrospect, in hindsight, you look at that and you go, how did this convince anybody? And yet it convinced some very high-powered scientists in the early 1900s. Another, and perhaps far more odious, embrace of archaeological hoaxing comes from this desire to prove a particular race, a particular ethnicity, a particular people are superior, and that can be shown archaeologically, that they invented everything, that they were first, that they had a much more expansive settlement in the past. And the people who are perhaps the best, meaning the worst at this, were the Nazis. These days, you go online, you go on social media, and people call each other Nazis all the time, and people get all upset when they're called Nazis. Real Nazis, when you call them Nazis, they say thank you, because they're that horrible. They're among the most terrible and odious and awful people who ever existed, killing millions and millions and millions, believing that their race, the Aryan race, was superior to all the other races. Now, Heinrich Himmler was like in charge of the concentration camps. This guy was pure evil. He actually wrote about the role of historians and archaeologists, what their proper role was. I am now going to read you what Himmler said. Quote, "The one and only thing that matters to us, and the thing these people meaning archaeologists and historians, the thing these people are paid for by the state is to have ideas of history that strengthen our people in their necessary national pride. In all this troublesome business, we are only interested in one thing, to project into the dim past the picture of our nation as we envisage it for the future. Our teaching of German origins has depended for centuries on falsification. We are entitled to impose one of our own at any time." The wonderful archaeologist Bettina Arnold has written extensively on the Nazis using archaeology as propaganda. So you hear what he's saying. He's saying, yeah, we make stuff up all the time, and we have every right to about anything that glorifies our past. And to show you the kind of stuff they did, this slide, the slide you're looking at, shows a map of the Neolithic, meaning thousands of years ago in Europe. The black in this map, this was produced by Nazi scholars. The black in that map represents the homeland. This is where the Aryans originated. But all of that, the cross-hatching and all those arrows point to where they claim archaeology shows Aryans had been in the past. So you know what their argument was? It was, well, if we can prove that Aryans were in France, we're in Poland, we're in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Norway, Sweden. If we can prove they were there 5,000 years ago, when we invade those countries, we're just taking back our fatherland. Yeah, it's that sick. The next photograph, trigger warning here, we've got Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler visiting a replication of a Mesolithic burial, proving the presence of Aryans in a far greater, far wider geographic expanse. So there's Hitler. I love the guy to Hitler's left. He's rocking that Hitler mustache, like thinking he looks really good. These are Nazis. These are awful people using archaeology to support their genocidal insanity. So, yeah, there are people who do that, people who use archaeology to further their racial, ethnic, or national aspirations. Another lesson in archaeological frauds, what to avoid. Now, this might sound contradictory. Don't be too successful. Now, what I mean by that is, if you're the only one who keeps finding additional evidence that everybody else is in awe of, and nobody else can find it, that's going to breed suspicion. Suspicion breeds resentment. And somebody's going to ask, what is going on? He's the only one who can find it. Here's a great example. This is from the 17th century in Italy. This guy on the screen, Curzio Inghirami, was the son of a wealthy guy. He lives in southern Italy. He lives in the area where the Etruscan Empire existed. Now, the Romans and the Etruscans, the Romans were a little bit later than the Etruscans, but they certainly had some interaction. But the Etruscans kind of lost out, and nobody can read their writing. So the history of the Etruscan Empire at this point in the 1640s was not very well known. Inghirami is walking around on the estate, and he says he finds an ampule, like a capsule, made of horsehair and clay and bitumen. When he opens it up, there's a scroll. And very conveniently, the scroll is written in Etruscan on top and Greek or Latin on the bottom. Well, when that happens, just like with the Rosetta Stone, which was Egyptian hieroglyphs on the top and Greek on the bottom, you can now translate hieroglyphs because you knew Greek. Because this was in Latin and in Etruscan, now they could translate Etruscan. So Inghirami translates it, and it tells this glorious history of the Etruscan Empire. Really puffs up their national pride. This happens, everybody gets really excited. We have to look for more of those. Maybe there are more scrolls that we can find to tell us more about Etruscan history. People go out looking for these, and nobody can find any. Now, if I'm Inghirami's manager or agent, I'm saying, Curzio, maybe find a couple more. That'll be cool. Because I certainly would not have gone along with his decision to find 150 more of these things. You have I get this impression of people scouring the hillside, looking and looking and looking, not finding anything. And Curzio going, there's one, there's another one. Oh, here's another one here. Oh, I got another one here. And people ate it up because it provided people of southern Italy with this glorious history that rivaled the history of Rome. Now, Curzio was smart. He didn't let anybody look really carefully at these things. But when they did, after he died, they found out that these ancient scrolls were all written on paper that had been manufactured in the 15th century in France. So unless we're talking about time travel, Etruscans come forward in time, buy some paper, go back in time and write some stuff, we know for sure these are 17th century hoaxes. This guy we're going to meet again, the guy in the cool outfit and the sword, that this is Charles Dawson. Now, Charles Dawson is heavily involved in the Piltdown fraud. We're going to talk a lot more about him. His issue or his problem is he was so lucky at finding things, they literally called him the Wizard of Sussex. Sussex is southern England. So look, folks, no, you don't want to be the wizard. If you want to pull off successful hoaxes, you can't be the wizard. Again, it breeds suspicion, resentment, and people are going to look very closely at the things you find when nobody else can find them. Far more recently, 2001, there's this poor guy, Shinichi Fujimura, archaeologist, paleoanthropologist in Japan. When he arrives on the scene, 1980s, the oldest archaeological artifacts found in Japan are 40,000 years old. This actually bothers Japanese folks who know that in China, in Korea, there are sites that are hundreds of thousands of years old, even more than 1 million, more than 1.5 million years old in northern China. So the Japanese are kind of like this postscript to Asian history based on archaeology. They only got there 40,000 years ago. Fujimura, who has no background at all in archaeology other than an amateur's interest, gets so lucky at finding ever older artifacts, they give him his own research institute, Archaeology Institute, and they fund it. They give him archaeologists, none of whom figure out something fishy is going on. Fujimura was so lucky at finding things, he literally was called the Hand of God, which sounds pretty cool if you're an archaeologist to have the Hand of God. It's not a good idea if you're pulling off hoaxes, because again, people are going to wonder, how is he so lucky? I tell you what, by the time Fujimura was done, the final thing that he announced was the discovery of artifacts that were 800,000 years old, 20 times older than the oldest artifacts found before Fujimura became an archaeologist in Japan. What you're looking at here on the screen is a screen grab from a hidden camera. A newspaper in Japan posted, they hit a camera in the area where Fujimura was digging, and that's him digging holes in the ground and planting artifacts that he had purchased on the mainland that dated to a much older date. He held a press conference and announced these, and right after that press conference, the newspaper held a press conference saying, here are the pictures of him planting these artifacts. Fujimura at first denied. He said, oh yeah, the last ones, there's so much pressure on me. Fujimura had become very, very famous in Japan, and he was beloved because he kept finding an older and older history. That's why the people in Japan were quite skeptical about him being so lucky, because they wanted to believe this. Happens again and again and again. I want to apologize for this, but I just thought Fujimura, as a very famous archaeologist, he was sort of the equivalent of a rock star. Okay, I'm sorry for that. I think that's kind of funny, actually. So he's a rock star in archaeology. He ultimately admitted that, yeah, he had been planting everything. When Fujimura arrived at the scene, they said, we're going to have to rewrite the history books for Japan. And when Fujimura was shown to be a fake, they had to go back and rewrite those rewritten textbooks because everything had been fake. And he had a tough life after that because he had been dishonored. Next law of archaeological frauds. Learn from your mistakes. It's really okay to screw up, to put together an artifact, or put together a site, or put together some object and have experts say, that ain't right. Because all you have to do is learn. They'll explain. I mean, this is terrible how archaeologists can be complicit, unconsciously complicit, in producing an archaeological fraud by, in fact, presenting the evidence for why that fraud is not true, right? And you learn from those mistakes. You learn those lessons. A perfect example of that is something, again, I'm going to talk about more in another lecture, the Newark Holy Stones. So David Wyrick, it's 1860, June of 1860. He's digging in an Indian burial mound, a Native American burial mound. And there's a lot of controversy over who built those mounds. And one of the theories was it was the lost tribes of Israel. That the tribes of Israel had sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, had landed in America, and had built these monuments out of earth. And what better way to prove it than to find an object like the one in the slide that is written in Hebrew. More about the Newark Holy Stones in another lecture. But here's the deal. Wyrick was not fluent. He wasn't an expert in Hebrew, so he brought this artifact to an Episcopalian minister who was, in fact, an expert in Hebrew. Handed it to him, and the expert said, nope, this is not ancient. This is a modern form of Hebrew, that the orthography, the way you write Hebrew, has changed over a couple of thousand years, and the stuff you got here, this artifact, this is like maybe 100 years old, a couple hundred years old, so it can't date to the ancient mounds. It's not a coincidence. It wasn't luck that in November of 1860, the same guy, David Wyrick, finds that, and that is a representation of the Ten Commandments written in the right kind of Hebrew. Hebrew from a couple of thousand years ago. Now, what are the odds that the same guy finds a fake and then finds the real deal months later, a few miles away? Or isn't it a lot more reasonable that whoever made that first object, whether it was Wyrick or somebody else, learned from the mistake, by hearing the minister say that's the wrong kind of Hebrew, went back to his basement, went back to the drawing board, and made a better example. Learn from your mistakes. Very important part of archaeological hoaxing. That being said, okay, remember, sarcasm emoji, hashtag parody. I don't really want you going out there and applying these to archaeological sites to produce these archaeological hoaxes. And what I want to do now is focus on what is likely the most, the least impactful maybe of all archaeological hoaxes, but by far, as I said, the most hilarious. We get in the time machine, we go back to 1869, October of 1869, in upstate New York. And we're going to visit the farm of, you can't make these names up. If I were writing a novel about a farmer in upstate New York, a country bumpkin farmer in the 1860s, I would name him Stub Newell, because that's what this guy's actual name was. And Stub owns a farm, and the way the story is told in newspaper articles and magazine articles at the time was that Stubb needed to dig a well on his property. Now, this is a map from November, so this is the next month, of Stubb's property. You see the Onondaga Creek there to the right, and if you look carefully on the left, you'll see left, kind of bottom left, is the dwelling house. Up and to the right, and around 2 o'clock is the barn. And right to the right of the barn, there's a little black figure that looks like a human being. That was the Cardiff Giant. Now, he hired a couple of guys to dig a well on the property. Told them where to dig. They dig about 3 feet down. And again, this is all newspaper accounts. They dig about 3 feet down, and they call him over. They say, Stubb, we got a problem. We want to dig the well, and the soil is nice, clean, agricultural soil, floodplain soil. And yet, they're at 3 feet. They hit this large boulder, and as they clean it off, they're looking at it and go, huh, looks like 2 giant human feet. So Stubb comes over, and you'd think he'd be like, a little angry that he wants to dig a well and they're finding this garbage. But instead he says, you know what, expand that dig. Let's expand it out and see what we're looking at here. And they do. It's a giant human being, apparently turned to stone, petrified like the trees in Arizona. 10 feet tall, more than 10 feet tall, completely turned to stone, naked, lying on his back. This is a photograph from October 1869. The person on the far right of the slide, that's Stub Newell, part of him, in the pit. And if you look above that, all those are the feet of his neighbors who Stubb invited to come on over, come see the amazing discovery I made. And the buzz was, whoa, this is a giant from before Noah's flood. This has got to be like Goliath or the Nephilim. This is a wonderful photograph. This is a couple days later. Stubb has erected a circus tent over the giant. Where did he get a circus tent so quickly? Was Amazon Prime back then? You could get it the next day? I don't think so. But he's got a circus tent that he erects over it, and then he starts charging people 2 bits, 25 cents a pop, to come and see the Cardiff Giant. And it hits the local newspapers, and suddenly there's this explosion of interest. Initially, just in the area, Cardiff, the town he lived in, is very close to Syracuse, which is the nearest big city. But there's Albany, and further away there's Buffalo, and then there's New York City, and Philadelphia, and Boston, and Hartford, and New Haven. And people are literally coming from all over to see the remains of this miracle. This man turned to stone, this giant from before Noah's flood. See, that's the Newell farm. The farmhouse is on the left. The barn is on the right, and you see the circus tent over there. By the way, Stub Newell, Disney has nothing on Stub Newell. Stub Newell was charging people to bring them to the farm from the train station. His wife was making sandwiches and cider to sell to the people. So he's got the whole thing. He's got the whole thing taken care of here with selling you the tickets, selling you the transportation, selling you food, selling you drink. Local businessmen took notice that this was a big deal, and they get involved. This is the line from the Bible that people were quoting about the Cardiff Giant. This is Genesis 6:4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Essentially, what we're talking about here is that angels, maybe fallen angels, came to earth, had intercourse with human women who gave birth to giants, the Nephilim, who were mighty men. And maybe Goliath was one of these guys. And maybe the Cardiff Giant was one of these guys. So you've got people embracing what turns out to be a really obvious hoax. They embrace it because, hey, scientists didn't know this, but a farmer in upstate New York proved the legitimacy of a Bible story. And man, Stubnewell was smart, but we know actually the brains were behind him in the person of George Hull, who was a cigar manufacturer in Binghamton, and he's the guy we're going to talk about a little more, who really was the brains behind it. I mean, I love this, right? 1869, it's probably the beginning of November, and you have folks gathered around the circus tent with their top hats and women dressed in their finery, and according to newspaper accounts, they were ushered in like 25, 30 at a time, and there was a sheet over the giant, to add to the drama. Stubnewell hired, are you ready, a circus barker, a guy who was there selling his wares at the circus, or carnival, and when everything was quiet, these little lamps lit the, kerosene lamps lit the interior of the tent, the barker would remove the sheet in a flourish, and this is a quote, grown men would gasp and women would faint at the sight of the naked Cardiff Giant. Although you will notice, judiciously, they put a fig leaf over the giant's, junk. This is an engraving from the period, and I love it. You see all these people all excited with their top hats. I had seen this a million times, and I had never noticed something until when I was teaching this in a class, a young undergraduate woman in the front row raised her hand. And I said, yeah? She goes, yeah, I'm looking at that slide, and I'm looking at the woman on the left with the binoculars. I said, yeah, there's opera glasses, same thing. And she goes, yeah, what is she aiming her opera glasses at that she's trying to get in focus? And I said, well, let's draw a line. You can draw your own conclusions about what she was using the opera glasses for. P.T. Barnum. You gotta love P.T. Barnum. Connecticut native, brilliant showman, brilliant businessman, brilliant politician. Barnum used scams and hoaxes and humbugs all the time, but he always justified it by saying, I'm using those to bring people in so they can see the real deal. And he was pretty progressive, actually, politically progressive for the time. Well, Barnum saw a good thing, right? He saw, wow, these guys are raking in the dough, but it's really local. I have a circus that travels around. If I could buy the giant, I could put him in my circus in the sideshow, and I could travel around. I could make bank. I could make a lot more money than these guys are ever going to make. So he offered them $30,000 to buy the giant. Offered Stubnewell. Now, $30,000, it's hard really to know precisely, but I once had an economist who did a kind of back of the envelope calculation and said, 1869, $30,000, it's about $750,000 today. Whoa! So here's a simple country farmer who's being offered the equivalent of $750,000 for a big piece of stone. Local businessmen, though, as I mentioned, they noticed they had an uptick in business. Hotel owners, lots of people coming down to Syracuse, because Cardiff has like one rooming house. Syracuse has hotels. Syracuse has restaurants. Syracuse has all the kinds of stuff that tourists are going to want. And sure enough, the businessmen go to Stubb and they go, you sell that giant, all that goes away. This economic boom that Syracuse is experiencing disappears. So they offered Stubb, they made Stubb an offer, $30,000, the same that Barnum offered, but we only want a 3/4 interest in the giant. Every dollar we make after that, you still keep 25 cents, Stubnewell says. Yes. Signs the paperwork, and the giant is now owned by this consortium. P.T. Barnum, you got to know, if you know anything about P.T. Barnum, he's not going to let that sit. He's going to do something about it, and he does, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The businessmen decide, you know what, the much bigger audience for the giant is in Syracuse, so they raise him up. This is an engraving of two guys levering him up. Here's a photograph. It's actually a photograph of them using pulleys to bring him up out of the ground on the farm. and taking him to Syracuse and then to Albany and to a bunch of other places. And there are estimates of how many thousands of people saw the giant. It was hundreds of people every day, thousands of people on the weekend. It was that big a deal to people. It was controversial and fascinating and interesting, and maybe it proved a story in the Bible. O.C. Marsh. Othniel C. Marsh was a paleontologist at Yale University, very famous guy. If you visit any natural history museum east of the Mississippi, certainly in New York, the American Museum of Natural History there, the Peabody Museum at Yale, and you look at the dinosaur bones, O.C. Marsh's name will be associated with the original discoveries of things like Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops from the American West. So Marsh was a big deal. Marsh visited the Cardiff Giant. I mean, the guy's a paleontologist, famous paleontologist. He's like, Carl Sagan and other famous scientists today, all wrapped together. Here's what he has to say in the Syracuse Daily Journal. It is of very recent origin and a most decided humbug. Very short exposure of the statue would suffice to obliterate all traces of tool marks and also to roughen the polished surfaces. But these are still quite perfect, and hence the giant must have been very recently buried. I am surprised that any scientific observers should not have at once detected the unmistakable evidence against its antiquity. And in fact, that's what happened. Geologists came and saw it and said, that's gypsum. That's not a very strong rock. That doesn't preserve very well. An artist looked at it and said, well, here, there's evidence of tool marks over here. Turns out that when the statue was actually made, the sculptors didn't know what the purpose was, and they gave it a beard. And George Hull, who was responsible, he recognized that it's going to take a lot for people to believe this is authentic. Nobody's going to believe a beard could solidify or petrify. So they removed it, and yet today when you look at the giant, you can see all these scratch marks where they had removed the beard. So there's important. Scientists said this is fake, and it really didn't make that much of a difference. It didn't cut back on the visitation. This is a bill. This is November of 1869. They brought the giant to Albany, again, to gin up interest, to make more money by bringing the giant to its potential audience. So this just gives the details. All right, let's go back to George Hull. Here's the deal behind George Hull. We know he did it. He confessed. In December of 1869, he gave an interview to newspapers and said, all right, I did it. Yeah, that's just joking around. Turns out that George Hull, now sometimes hoaxes involving religion are people trying to prove their religion. This is the opposite. This is like that guy with the Noah's Ark dipped in teriyaki marinade. He was an atheist. George Hull made fun of people who believed in God. And apparently he was visiting his daughter and son-in-law in Iowa and ran into a minister. And the minister was a firm believer in every word of the Bible, literal truth of the Bible. And Hull was giving him a hard time. Said, you believe this stuff? And he said, yeah, I believe in everything. And then they turned to a page of the Bible about Goliath. And Hull asks the minister, so you believe there was a 10-foot tall giant? You can't be serious. And then, no. And then Hull walked away from that encounter. And he said, that night, Hull says, I couldn't fall asleep, tossing and turning. How can I monetize this? How can I take advantage of people who believe this stuff? And that's when he realized that right near where he was, there were quarries of gypsum, a relatively soft rock that would be easy to carve. He bought a 12-foot, 3,000-pound chunk of gypsum, and he shipped it to Chicago. And he hired 2 sculptors to carve it into a giant naked guy. I cannot imagine what these guys were thinking when this crazy guy said, yeah, I'd like you to carve a giant naked guy on his back. It probably isn't the ordinary kind of request sculptors get. Hull also told them, keep it a secret. I don't want anybody to know you're doing it. So put up curtains, put up blankets around the window so people can't hear you doing it. Only work on the weekends when nobody else is around. Well, a buck is a buck, so the sculptors took the offer. After they were done, and they had to remove the beard, Hull had it shipped to Cardiff, New York. He is cousin of Stub Newell. So they're relatives, so they were in on it together. They had it shipped by train. They obviously had people who were part of the hoax, who helped them carry the thing to the farm, dug the hole, put him in the whole ground, buried him. They left him there for a year to kind of steep. Hull explained that he didn't want anybody remembering, if it was found like right after they brought it to the farm, maybe somebody would remember seeing the wagon. But he also wanted it to give it an appearance of age. He knew that gypsum would erode, would weather relatively quickly, so put it in the ground, it would make it look older than it actually was. The funny thing is, one of the geologists who looked at the Cardiff Giant before the confession said, this thing can't be in the ground for more than a year. It wouldn't last that long. So he had it dead on, dead to rights. That's exactly what happened. When Hull announced that the thing was a fake, the consortium of businessmen still had to make back their money, and so they brought the giant around to various venues, and fewer people came to see him. They offered a $5,000 reward for anybody who could prove it was a fake. That was just for publicity. Now here's a sign that says something that's a lie. Cardiff Giant, taller than Goliath. P.T. Barnum offered $150,000 for the giant. They made that up. But what the heck, if you're flogging a fake giant, why not make up the money? That's 5 times more than Barnum actually offered them. So they're taking them out to fairs. They're taking them out to expositions. They want people to see the giant. The people up in Albany showing the giant get news that there's an ad in a newspaper in New York City. Here's what it reads. Woods Museum and Menagerie, successor to Barnum's, on Broadway, corner of 30th Street. If you look down that, you see one of the things they're offering? The Great Stone Giant. Wait, what? The giant's in Albany. The people who own the giant in Albany write a letter. They're angry to the New York Times. To the editor of the New York Times, we desire to inform the public through your column that the statue now on exhibition at Woods Museum is a plaster cast taken from the original by C.F. Otto, an artist of Syracuse, without our knowledge and consent. You kind of wonder, how the heck do you make a plaster cast of a 10-foot tall stone giant without the owners of the giant knowing? What did they break in? It's hard to understand. Anyway, the Cardiff Giant is now at the State Geological Hall in Albany, where a room was placed at our disposal by the authorities of the state. It will shortly be in New York, and when open for exhibition, the announcement will duly be made through your advertising columns. So what's going on? What's going on is that P.T. Barnum had a fake made. If he couldn't buy the real giant, he made a fake giant and was displaying it as the real giant in New York. The saddest part of the story, this is in December of 1869 and January of 1870, is they did bring the real giant to New York and they advertised it. And my God, they put the advertisement for the real giant directly below the advertisement for the fake giant. So literally you open the New York Times, you go, oh, there's Woods Museum. Oh, the Great Stone Giant for 30 cents. Awesome. Then right below that, Apollo Hall, the original Cardiff Giant, 50 cents. So what do you want to do? You want to pay 30 cents for P.T. Barnum's giant that he's saying is the real deal? Or do you want to pay 50 cents for the giant that the people saying is the real deal? Barnum's is a fake of the fake. The giant is a fake. And now this is a fake of the fake. Double negative. Does that make it real? No, it doesn't at all. It's pretty hilarious. And when you look at a Google Earth right now, the 2 venues where the Giants were, 3-minute walk, one from the other. So hell, why not see them both when you're in New York? And the story gets sillier and sillier and sillier. And as a result, a lot of folks in the 19th century started making fun of the whole thing. I am about to read you a poem. Well, part of a poem. The title of the poem is The True Origin of the Cardiff Giant. In ancient days, as we are told, Noah marched the animals into the fold, then closed the door of hickory bark, of which material he made the ark. So the giant is on Noah's ark. He shipped a man of wondrous size, who was noted for his wondrous lies. There was but one of his race to be found, and he was so wicked, Noah had him bound. Well, he's getting antsy on the ark. He's all tied up. He decides, jump off the ark. Hey, I'm tall enough. It'll be fine. Sinks to the bottom and drowns. The poem continues. The flood subsided, and on time flew. Of the giant that drowned, no man ever knew, until the matter was lately made clear by a man at Cardiff, not far from here. One day, as he was digging a well, he struck something hard. What it was, he couldn't tell. So he dug all around, and there he found a monstrous man stuck fast in the ground. It's a terrible poem, but what's cool is it was written by L. Frank Baum. The guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz wrote a poem about the Cardiff Giant. And now we come to the scary story called a ghost story. So a gentleman taking a room in New York gets in a hotel that's otherwise abandoned. It's dark, it's dirty, it's dingy, but it's the only room available. And he lies in his room and he hears something. He hears footfalls, heavy steps outside his door. The door doesn't open, and yet he feels that something is there in his room. The door did not open, and yet I felt a faint gust of air fan my cheek, and presently was conscious of a huge, cloudy presence before me. I watched it with fascinated eyes. A pale glow stole over the thing. Gradually, its cloudy folds took shape. An arm appeared, then legs, then a body. At last, a great, sad face looked out of the vapor. Stripped of its filming housings, naked, muscular, and comely, the majestic Cardiff Giant loomed above me. That was written by Mark Twain. He thought the story was so hilarious, he actually wrote about the ghost of the Cardiff Giant. And the upshot of the story is that it's the ghost, the Cardiff Giant ghost, is haunting that hotel because his body is being displayed across the street. Now, when the man hears this from the giant, says, I'm the Cardiff Giant and it's my ghost and I can't rest in peace until my body is reburied, the guy jumps off the bed and starts laughing. Hilarious, hilarious. The giant says, I've just shared with you this very sad fact and you're laughing? And the guy says, well, you got to understand, that thing across the street, that's not your body. That's P.T. Barnum's fake. The Cardiff Giant has fooled everyone, and now he fools himself. And the giant just looks crestfallen, and he says, look, do me a favor. Don't tell anybody. And slowly but surely, his ghost vanishes. It's a funny story, and it's vintage Mark Twain. Cardiff Giant making lots of travels throughout the Northeast especially. And people are flocking to see the giant. Not as a legitimate artifact from Noah's flood, but as this really funny story. So, I know a lot of you probably are familiar with American history, maybe presidential history. And if you're familiar with Stephen Sondheim, you know that in 1901, in the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, something really important happened. But it's not what you think. Oh, you think it's because McKinley was assassinated by Leon Czolgosz, guy from Michigan, anarchist? I will not now begin singing the Ballad of Czolgosz because it's too terrible. But yes, Czolgosz in September of 1901 came to the fair, shot McKinley twice. McKinley lingered for about a week, and this is in September. Lingered for about a week. Then he died. Between September and the end of October, Czolgosz was caught, is apprehended, he was tried, he was convicted, and he was executed within a period of just a few weeks. But I'm really disappointed that Stephen Sondheim did not, in his show Assassins, where he highlights what happened at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, that he forgets entirely that the most important thing, from my perspective, that happened at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo was that they brought out the Cardiff Giant. The Cardiff Giant was on display. So, and really close by to where the assassination occurred. So that red arrow is to the left is pointing to the scene of the crime. The close-up of that is on the right. Now, up in the northwestern quadrant of the fair, you see this place called the War Cyclorama. It's a 360-degree painting of war through the ages. Just beyond that, and this is very hard to see on this map, but I've got a photograph. Right where that arrow is pointing, there's a little box, and it says Cardiff Giant. And this wonderful photograph of 1901, the Pan American Exposition, shows there on the left the exhibit hall where there is the Cardiff Giant. This is a kind of pixelated version, close up. The great Cardiff Giant discovered in the year 1869, now on exhibition. So there at the World's Fair, they've got the Cardiff Giant on display. What happens next is really interesting. The consortium of businessmen, the people who own the Giant, they're not that happy having it anymore. It's not really the moneymaker that they wanted it to always be, so they sell it. They sell it to a newspaper editor in Iowa near where the gypsum originated. So, he kind of felt like he was bringing the Giant home. This is a photograph from National Geographic in 1939 of the basement of that guy's house. And sure enough, there's the Cardiff Giant. He's got, I guess it's his daughter, sitting on a naked giant, well, whatever, and her friend, and it's a real conversation piece. You go to somebody's house and you go, yeah, this is something I got in Arizona. Oh, this is something I bought in France. Oh, yeah, here's a giant naked guy in my basement. I guess that is interesting. Here's the funniest part about it. There are things that happen to me that could happen to nobody else. I did a talking head thing on an interview for a History Channel show about archaeological frauds, and they focused on the Cardiff Giant. The day after that aired, the dean of students at Central Connecticut, I think it was then State College, became university later on, calls me up on the phone in my office and says, Ken, when I was a little kid growing up in Iowa, the guy across the street from me was a newspaper editor, and in kindergarten, my best friend was his son, and I used to go over to his house and play all the time, and we'd go in the basement, and there was a giant statue of a naked man there. And I said, oh my God, you grew up across the street from the Cardiff Giant. Amazing. And the best part about it is that my book, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience and Archaeology, has an entire chapter devoted to the Cardiff Giant, and the dean bought like 10 copies of my book that I signed, and he gave them to all of his relatives back in Iowa, which was really kind of a hoot for me. Anyway, so he owns it for a while. A new director of the New York State Historical Association is installed, says, you know what, we ought to have the Giant, because the scene of the crime is right here in New York. And they bought it. I think it's $30,000. That's the set fee for a giant naked fake statue of a petrified man. Bought it and returned it to New York. They have a sign now on the road near where Newell's farm was, historical sign. Here they are boxing him up, laying him to rest in the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, which is pretty close to Cardiff and Syracuse. There they've got flowers on the Giant's chest. I think I first saw the Giant, I couldn't have been much more than 12 years old. Parents putting the kids in the car, getting up really early in the summer for a 2-week vacation car ride, seeing the Baseball Hall of Fame, yay, and seeing the Farmers Museum, where there in a little shed outside was the Cardiff Giant. And I remember at 12 going, what, people believe that? Wow, that was really pretty cool. And it's just real fun for me to know that I, as an adult, got to kind of research it and write a chapter in a book about it. Now I'm talking to you about the Cardiff Giant. If you look closely at his face, you can see the tool marks where they removed the beard. And there are his feet. Sometime after my original encounter with the Cardiff Giant, they got some funding to put up a circus tent. This is still at the Farmers Museum, and it was a really nice display inside where he was put in the ground as if you were at the Newell farm back in 1869. And there he is. And we've come a long way, folks. No longer do we need a fig leaf over the Cardiff Giant's, There he is with his hand resting. He's got this little bit of a smile. And I think, maybe that was intentional. Maybe they're saying, yeah, we pulled a fast one on y'all. And there's his beautiful hand and his head. All pictures of the Cardiff Giant. It's like my family album. I have pictures of my kids, and I have pictures of, the Cardiff Giant. More recently, they moved the Giant into the exhibit hall when you walk in, the Welcome Center, and he is now there with a replica of that sign I showed you earlier saying that P.T. Barnum paid $150,000 for the Giant. So he's in a really nice place now, and he won't erode much anymore. Fairly recently, they took him on the road, and he was actually in Connecticut for a while at an exhibit of archaeological and historical frauds. So he may be a fake. It may have been transparent. It may have been obvious. But you know what? He's immortal now as the great Cardiff Giant hoax. From a comic strip, we've got Alley-oop, the kind of archetypical caveman, encountering none other than the Cardiff Giant. Thanks for listening.